Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this RCSLT webinar, Celebrating Multiculturalism for European Day of Speech and Language Therapy. My name is Mark Jays. I'm a Research Fellow in Communication Disability at Manchester Metropolitan University, and I'm also RCSLT representative to CPLOL, which I'll be talking to you about a little bit later. I'm chairing the webinar, and I'm joined this afternoon by my co-presenter, Dr. Julie Marshall, who's a reader in Communication, Disability and Development at Manchester Metropolitan University. I'm just going to give you a little bit of housekeeping information. So the webinar is about 45 minutes long. We will have some time for questions at the end. In terms of how you can interact with the webinar, please use the Q&A button on the webinar software to submit a question. And you can submit a question at any time, and we'll answer as many as we can in the Q&A session at the end. And we'll answer any others that we received after the webinar and make sure that the answers are made available to you. And you can use the chat button on the webinar software to send an instant message to the host. And you can do that anytime during the event. If you're using Twitter, please do join in the conversation using the hashtag RCSLT webinar. And this webinar is being recorded, and it will go online with slides approximately 2 weeks after the event. And Kaylee is at hand if we need any help with the technicalities. Okay. So the aims and objectives of the webinar today, we're hoping that after the webinar, you'll be able to, you'll understand more about CPLOL, its aims and its activities. You'll understand how culture can affect communication behaviours and attitudes to communication disability, and also understand how learning from low and middle income countries can support speech and language therapists working with new and recent migrants to the UK. So as I said, I'm Mark Jays, and I'm going to start the webinar today by talking to you a little bit about CPLOL. I'm really pleased that so many people are able to join us from across the UK and also from further afield. I'm going to give you some background information on CPLOL for those of you who aren't familiar with the organisation. CPLOL is an umbrella organisation that's made up of different professional SLT associations across Europe. CPLOL was formed in 1988 to develop and promote the profession, and the RCSLT was one of its founding members. CPLOL has changed and grown over the last 32 years, and we currently have 30 member associations across 28 countries. And the reason that those two numbers aren't the same is that in some countries across Europe, there is more than one professional association. The name CPLOL stands for its French title, which you can see at the top of the slide. And this translates as the Standing Liaison Committee of Speech and Language Therapists, Logopedists in the European Union. But I really want to point out today that membership of the EU is not a requirement for membership of CPLOL. So our membership of CPLOL continues post-Brexit. And at the bottom of the slide, you can find details of how you can interact with CPLOL and find out more about the organisation. And you'll also be able to find some information about CPLOL on the RCSLT website. Here you can see the latest vision and mission statements for CPLOL. I won't read them out, but I'd like to highlight to you that CPLOL aims to represent and promote the interests of the speech and language therapy profession on the European stage. CPLOL strives to increase the visibility of our work and to raise awareness of the profession and the needs of the people we work with at various levels, so amongst policymakers, other professional groups, third sector organisations and the public. CPLOL also aims to improve professional and educational standards in speech and language therapy and contribute to enhanced research activity in the field. And one of CPLOL's key mechanisms for achieving these aims is by promoting and facilitating collaborations between speech and language therapists across Europe. But I want to turn now to think a little bit about how you as individual RCSLT members can benefit from RCSLT's membership of CPLOL. Through CPLOL, you have access to diverse learning opportunities. You can gain from the expertise and knowledge of colleagues across Europe who are experts in a range of conditions and client groups and who work with individuals from linguistically and culturally diverse backgrounds. One way to do this is to attend CPLOL's Scientific Congress, which it organises every 3 years, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. CPLOL is also developing a series of webinars on various topics to meet its members' CPD needs, so keep your eyes open for those. But you also have access to a rich network of speech and language therapists working across Europe within education, practice and research contexts. CPLOL currently represents thousands of SLTs across Europe and has links to IELP, ASHA and Speech Pathology Australia and other umbrella organisations across the world. As your representative, I can disseminate information to other SLT associations about RCSLTs and its individual members' activities and initiatives. But RCSLT and its members can also use CPLOL as a way of obtaining information from other speech and language therapy associations in Europe, so the networking opportunities are immense. And in terms of research, CPLOL could partner on European and national grants as an end-user non-profit organisation. So CPLOL's inclusion as a partner on a research grant can really help create significant impact for projects that are relevant to speech and language therapy. And I wanted to let you know that CPLOL is currently undergoing a structural reorganisation. In response to feedback from its members, CPLOL wants to become even more visible, more strategic, and have more tangible outcomes and impacts. And one of the most obvious outward signs of this change will be a name change for CPLOL. So when I attend the next CPLOL Commission meeting on your behalf at the end of this month, I'll be asked to vote on a new name for the organisation. So again, watch this space and you'll soon find out what CPLOL is going to be called in future. As part of its awareness raising campaign, CPLOL organises European Day of Speech and Language Therapy every year on the 6th of March, which is CPLOL's official birthday. Each year there's a clinical theme, and this year it's reading and writing difficulties. And on the slide here you can see the UK version of the European Day advertisement poster for 2020. And today's webinar is an early celebration of European Day. But on Friday, CPLOL members across Europe will be holding awareness raising events. For example, in the UK, student SLTs will be hosting information stalls in various locations to talk to the public about speech and language therapy and how we work with children and adults with literacy difficulties. So really, European Day is all about giving voice to the people we work with, but on a European level. Earlier I mentioned the CPLOL Congress. Next year the Congress will be held in Bilbao, Spain, and the theme is raising SLT visibility through research and professional practice. We're expecting attendees from across the world. At the last Congress in 2018 in Portugal, we attracted over 600 delegates from across the world, and these delegates had the opportunity to attend 121 oral presentations and 221 poster presentations. So the Congress is really an ideal opportunity to learn about the latest research, practice and education innovations in SLT. And I'm chair of the scientific committee for the next Congress, and I really look forward to receiving your abstract when the call opens on the 18th of May. The Congress is the perfect place to disseminate your work to an international audience. It's also a really social occasion where you can network and create new collaborations with colleagues from across the world. I've been RCSLT representative to CPLOL since 2016, and this is a voluntary role and any member of RCSLT can apply for it. And my job is to represent the views and interests of RCSLT members at CPLOL and also to facilitate information exchange and collaboration between the two organisations. I'm assisted aptly in my role in the UK by the RCSLT CPLOL Action Group, and this consists of SLTs Dr. Hazel Rodham, Rumman Kaur, Leslie Cherriman, Susan Guthrie, and SLT student, SLT to be, Katie Levy. And this group of volunteers have helped me to disseminate information about CPLOL and its work to the UK membership. And on the right of this slide, you can see a flyer that Katie designed to help UK members understand more about CPLOL and what it does. The Action Group also helps me to respond to individual inquiries from UK members about education, practice and research abroad, and also from members of other country associations about how education, practice and research in speech and language therapy work in the UK. And the groups also support me to spread the word about European Day every year and organise education events. And I want to talk to you a little bit about one of those events now. So we organised our first study day last November in Birmingham on the topic of inclusive service provision for people from different cultural and linguistic backgrounds. It was a really successful day and we attracted 110 multidisciplinary delegates. You can read more about the day on page 5 of this month's bulletin. We were lucky enough to secure 2 keynote speakers. So we invited Professor Wiebke Scharf-Reffelt from Germany, and also my colleague, Dr. Julie Marshall, who presented, and the keynote speakers presented their work on multiculturalism, and you'll be able to hear more from Julie in just a moment. But the day also included 5 fascinating presentations on UK research, practice and education developments related to inclusive service provision. We're hoping to organise another study day in 2021, so keep your eyes peeled on the RCSLT website and on Twitter for publicity about that later this year, and please do get involved. So thank you very much for listening to me talk to you about CPLOL, and I'd like to wish you all a very happy European Day of Speech and Language Therapy for Friday. And do keep your eyes peeled for activity on Twitter. They'll be tweeting from across Europe and the world. And please do get in touch with me after this webinar if you need any more information about CPLOL or the action group. And I look forward to answering your specific questions later in the webinar. But now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Julie Marshall, who is a reader in Communication, Disability and Development at Manchester Metropolitan University. And Julie's going to talk to us about her exciting research in low and middle income countries.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for the invitation to talk to you. Before I get started talking to you about culture, communication, disability and learning from low and middle income countries, I'd like to just say a few words about the terminology that I'm going to be using this afternoon. I'm not going to defend or explain that. That's probably something for a conversation for another day. But I'm going to use the term people with communication disability. I'm going to be talking a little bit more widely then than just speech and language therapy. I'm going to be using the term low and middle income country, not developing countries or the global south. And you'll hear me referring to underserved populations or groups as we go through this presentation. I'm going to talk to you about 4 main things this afternoon. The current context of services for people with communication disabilities that I've shortened to PWCD in low and middle income countries, LMICs here. I'm going to take that information about the context and help us to think about how that might help us to learn for delivering services in the UK, and think a little bit more broadly about the benefits to the UK of its healthcare workers working in low and middle income countries, and then a little bit of a sidestep to think about culture and its impact on services for people with communication disability. Finally, there'll be a few slides that I may not have time to show today with some extra references and information about working internationally. I apologise, I'm going to touch only very briefly on each of these topics, but I hope that they will whet your appetite and lead you to go away and do some more reading and finding out. So the first area that I want to touch on is just a little bit of understanding about what's the current context for people with communication disabilities in low and middle income countries. So even qualified and experienced speech and language therapists in the UK will often be very shocked when I talk to them about how few speech and language therapists there are in many low and middle income countries. My knowledge is more in sub-Saharan Africa than other places in the world, where there are really very, very few speech and language therapists. Typically 1 speech and language therapist for every 2, 3, 4, 5 million people, that kind of number. So about 15, 20 people who are qualified in Ghana, 20-ish in Kenya, between 1, 2 or 3 people in Rwanda, which has a population of 11 million. Figures are slightly higher or much higher in some other, particularly Asian countries. Consequently, and related to that, there are often very limited opportunities to study to be a speech and language therapist. So if you're in a country where there are few speech and language therapists, it's really difficult to set up educational programs because you don't have the people to teach, to provide clinical education, to ensure that there are employment opportunities afterwards. So things are tricky, but people are doing a lot of work setting things up. You'll be unsurprised to hear that communication disability is often under-recognised by health, education, epidemiological services, partly because it's invisible, it's secondary to more obvious disabilities or impairments, and is often assumed to be related to deafness, and that's about as far as people's knowledge go. Again, the knowledge of the general public, their awareness about communication disability is variable. People again assume it's deafness that is the cause, or if there's another obvious impairment or disability, for example, an intellectual impairment or disability, people will focus on that and not think particularly about the communication issues. So it may be that nothing is done, people aren't seeking services. There are very varied beliefs and attitudes about communication, communication disability and intervention. So people might hide their family member at home if they can't talk because of shame and stigma. They might blame the parents, particularly the mum. Conversely, they might go out and really fight for services. Partly as a consequence of the lack of speech and language therapy, and therefore experts to raise awareness and do training, and the lack of epidemiological data about communication disability, then there are often few other services available. Although there's some really interesting work going on about what people do in the absence of services, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Societies are becoming much more heterogeneous in the same way that they are in the UK. So lovely example, for example, in Kenya, of differences in children's vocabulary depending whether they're in an urban or a rural setting. That really gets us thinking about that kind of diversity. We know there are 70 million forcibly displaced people across the world, so a lot of movement, a lot of diversity. Multilingualism is the norm, much more than it is in the UK, and not just bilingualism. And so expectations and the actual reality of being able to do things like have standardized tests and norms of language development are really tricky. So given that current situation, what can we learn in the UK? How has that got anything to do with what we're doing in the UK? I think the first thing is that if you're working in a situation where there are very few speech and language therapists, it gets us thinking a lot about what else we can do. Thinking much more about task shifting, challenging our ideas about what speech and language therapists versus others do. Do we have to do all that we do now? Could we have somebody who's just an expert in swallowing or an expert just in stammering? There's also some really interesting and exciting new ways of educating speech and language therapists where they're expected to take on some really different roles from those in the UK. And it gets us really thinking about how, in the absence of things like norms, standardized assessments, how we get our students to really use their knowledge about the basic underpinning knowledge to apply that in places where there aren't lots of other norms, etc. The questions about self-help and self-help and help seeking are actually really interesting in low and middle income countries. So they've taught us an awful lot about what people do if they suspect that somebody's got a communication disability. Who would they go to for help, and what would they do themselves? So it's got us certainly thinking from research in Ghana and in Fiji about people looking for services, for example, and support from religious leaders, community leaders, traditional healers, perhaps that we don't use as much as we could do in the UK, and the kind of strategies that people are using to self-help. And that leads us into really thinking about new collaborators and services without speech and language therapists. That heterogeneity of culture, languages, etc., obviously applies in the UK as well, and really helps us think about new ways of working, new ways of thinking. Some of our work in low and middle income countries also gets us to think very differently about ethics. So we think in the UK, in ethical terms, certainly in research, that there's a kind of objectivity about ethics. For example, that we should have autonomous decision making, and gets us really thinking about how in other countries making a decision on your own isn't always the case. And for those of us who are new to that way of working in the UK, can be quite useful. International working also gets us to have to think about some really tricky and challenging issues around colonialism, around power, and around criticality. So uncomfortable political histories that some other high-income countries do address, but we perhaps aren't so used to doing that in the UK. So some really interesting but challenging thinking. I want to move now just to talk very quickly about those more general benefits of working internationally. So if you're a UK healthcare worker, what are the benefits if you go and work in a low and middle income country? So there's an all-party parliamentary group on global health that has looked specifically at the question of improving health at home and abroad. and has particularly looked at the benefits to the NHS of international volunteering, so benefits around leadership development, sharing innovation, about developing international relationships, which are all really positive and much more have a much broader view than perhaps they did 10, 20, 30 years ago, where if you went to work in a low and middle income country, would be treated a little bit like you'd been on your holidays and there wasn't any learning for being in the UK. I think one of the things that perhaps we do have to think a bit about, though, is there's a lot of emphasis put on these international relationships, building up relationships with our colleagues in low and middle income countries, encouraging them to come and work in the UK, and whether that is really ethical when you're working in a setting that's got very few specialist healthcare professionals, and that we're encouraging to leave that country and work in the UK. Communication Therapy International, which is an RCSLT clinical excellence network, has also suggested that working internationally benefits your skills in terms of problem solving and flexibility, thinking outside the box, learning to prioritize what really matters, and certainly around training and educating other people, really getting us to think about, if you've only got a short amount of time with somebody you're training or with a client, what really matters. And that understanding that simple descriptions and cutting things down to the real essence is really hard. I want to mention something again, just really briefly, about the notion of global health and global health competencies. So this understanding through global health that health is determined by problems, issues and concerns that are outside national boundaries, that transcend them. And that's particularly relevant at the moment, obviously, as we're starting to think very seriously about coronavirus. But important to us as we have migrants coming to the UK, bringing perhaps new kinds of communication disabilities around trauma, malnutrition, neglect, that may be very new to us. There's some great work done by Diaz et al. That looks at the kind of competencies that qualified health professionals should be developing in global health. And I'd really encourage everybody to have a look at those, because they really get us, again, thinking about things that we often don't consider as qualified speech and language therapists. So issues around global health governance, health systems, thinking about how differently health systems can be put together. So I think they're really good, stepping outside of the box thinking. So the fourth area that I'm going to touch on as I'm racing through this talk so that we might have a bit of time for questions is thinking about the impact of culture on communication disability and our work as speech and language therapists. And most of this won't be new to anybody who's listening today. I'm not suggesting that it is new, but if we take a very broad view of thinking about culture, we can see that there are lots of different factors that interface with culture and impact on us as speech and language therapists. I'm going to mention a couple of them while we're looking at this slide, and then just take you on to 2 more slides to look at a couple of these points in more detail. So we know that speech and language development occurs very differently depending on the languages we're learning, the order in which we learn language, the vocabulary that we might acquire, the development of syntax, speech sounds, etc. We know that those might well be related to culture and cultural features. We know that the epidemiology, leaping down to number 6, of communication disability will be very different in different places and related to the culture, the way we live and where we live. So things like sickle cell anemia, the epidemiology of deafness, HIV, AIDS, birth trauma, and how those different health conditions will affect communication disability and the frequency or and the prevalence of communication is really important. I want to just mention number 8 that's on here. Again, something perhaps we don't address very often and very directly is thinking about culture and our different ideas about health and illness and about help. So how do we see health? How do we see illness? What's our motivation for help? Who do we think we should go to for help if we've got a communication disability? Who do we think should give that help? How should the help be given? What help have we got? So we all deal with that every day in our clinical work as people set different goals and outcomes for intervention. But I think thinking about it really broadly in terms of culture can be really important for us. I'm going to move us on to our next slide and then just talk about numbers 2, 3, 4 and 5 within those last 2 slides. So again, some really broad thinking here in relation to culture around understanding how families and communities understand child rearing or child raising, language and language socialization, which again, I think we learn different parts about depending when and where we were educated as speech and language therapists. So thinking particularly about language socialization, so that idea about how it is that children acquire the communicative competence necessary for them to be appropriate members of their society and culture. So a quote from Martha Crago that really gets us to think about things like what kind of communicators and members of society are children expected to be and to become? What do we want children to say? To whom do we want them to be? People who initiate conversation? Do we want them to be people who contradict older people? Do we want them to be people who ask questions or who just answer questions? So it really fits with those ideas about language and communication. Who talks to whom and about what? That will be really vary between different members of different society. Who teaches communication? Do we assume that communication and language development need to be taught, or that children will just acquire it? Really important for us as speech and language therapists working with children, those questions about who cares for children, who are the people who are spending time with children, what kind of things are they doing, how many hours of the day, what are the vocabulary that they need, so that we're really thinking about those things that might vary. Similarly, thinking about literacy, who reads books, who looks at books, are they books with pictures, books with words, who does that? How do we see book reading with, by and for children? Similarly, thinking about play. What is play? How do individual family members think about play? Why do we play? If play is something that you keeps a child occupied while parents are working or planning a meal, then the idea of doing therapy through play might seem a very strange idea. So who plays? Why do they play? What are toys? What constitutes a toy? What constitutes a thing that we would play with? And why would you use it? So that we're really trying to get our heads around for individual families what that play actually means to them, so that when we're coming in with advice, it's actually congruent with or takes account of their views. Similarly, our understanding of different kinds of symbols. What pictures do people make sense of? What symbols might they see around the world, around the house, around the room, around their community? The use of objects as symbols that we know can be very variable from people from different places in the world. So I think what this work is doing is really challenging all the time our ideas about universality. Applies particularly around things like parent-child interaction therapy, where we often implicitly make assumptions about language, communication, play, etc. And then finally, moving on and thinking about some of these similar issues, but particularly in relation to attitudes towards and beliefs about communication disability. How often do we ask our clients very directly, what do you think has caused your communication disability? Do our clients feel able to say to us whether they think that it's a medical cause, whether they might have spiritual beliefs about a communication disability, and perhaps both of those things at once? How does that make sense to them? I might have a spiritual belief about why a supernatural being has caused a communication disability, even though I understand that there's a medical explanation of what a stroke actually is. We need to understand much more about social and community responses, spiritual or medical responses, how those things fit together, what families do in the face of communication disability that they might not feel able to say to us if the responses that they're making are not particularly medical ones or ones recommended by us. But moving on and thinking a little bit about adults, thinking about the variety in which acquired health conditions are viewed. What about if you see a stroke as something that's just going to go away next week? Does that mean that you won't engage in speech and language therapy because you're expecting that somebody's going to get better in the same way that they might do from flu? How's communication in the elderly viewed, and how are older people regarded? What are they expected to do? So that we're thinking, as lots of people do already, around what are the aims, what's the communication we think our clients are wanting to achieve, what really matters to them in their lives in terms of communication. and obviously really wide variations in caring expectations, so that we're really clear about who's spending time with an older person when we're thinking about how they communicate, what they communicate, about who's going to support them in communication as they're improving, hopefully, or managing a deterioration in communication. Who are the really important people who might be doing that? So I think I've whizzed through an awful lot of things really quickly. I hope the whistle stop tour for some people will confirm things that you already know about, but there might be one or two things in there that are perhaps new, challenging, people might disagree with. So I hope that that is useful. I'm just going to put up the last couple of slides quickly, but not speak to them, just to say that there are 3 more slides with references on. And for anybody who is particularly interested in work in low and middle income countries, the link there to the communication therapy RCSLT SEN, which provides lots of information for speech and language therapists planning to work in low and middle income countries, and to flag up that there will be very soon some new information on the RCSLT web pages as well about working in low and middle income countries. And we would absolutely love it, those of us who are involved in working in low and middle income countries, to make it the case that nobody who is going to work internationally does that without having looked at the resources, information that are available, and built on the mistakes that people have made before, so that you're improving and doing better work if you go to work in low and middle income countries. And that is my last slide. And if anybody wants to get in touch with me, that's my email address. So I hope I've whizzed through that quickly enough to allow a little bit of time for questions. Thank you. I'm going to pass over to Mark to handle the questions now.
Thank you very much, Julie, for a really interesting talk. We have had some questions that came in before the webinar, so I think we could have a look at some of those. And I think you've got sight of those as well, Julie. So we had a question that was submitted that says, how can we support individuals with learning disabilities to make choices around religious, cultural beliefs and elements? For example, capacity and consent around diet, activities, clothes and festivals. And I think, shall I start to answer that and bring you in, Julie? I think for me, this question is really about understanding what the nature of those decisions is, thinking about what are the decision options, are there risks and benefits associated with the decisions, consequences, and it's really important that if you're trying to support somebody to make those choices, that you understand the cultural and religious aspects associated with those decisions. So you need to talk to people who can give you that information if you're not aware of the information. So talk to the individual themselves, talk to their families. It may be important to talk to cultural informants from the local community, get as much support with that as you can. But it's also really important to understand how somebody's cultural and religious background may affect their decision-making behaviour and their attitudes towards decision-making. In the UK, as Julie suggested, and in the West generally, we focus very much on personal autonomy, whereas in some cultures, more collectivist cultures, there's much more focus on making decisions as a group, as a family. It would be very unusual for somebody to make a decision on their own. And as well as thinking about the communication needs caused by learning disability, obviously, you need to think about any specific language needs. If somebody doesn't speak English as a first language, and whether you need to work with an interpreter. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Julie.
I just added a couple of things, really. Mark's given a really comprehensive reply, given the short amount of time we've got. I think seeing culture in a really broad way for me is really important. So going beyond the obvious things that are presented to us around, say, diet, activities, etc., but actually thinking about trying to understand, particularly from that individual's point of view or from the family, what broader things culturally might be really important to them. What does food mean? What's important about food in terms of who you eat with and when you eat, and who prepares that food? What place does food have within a particular family or community, so that you're understanding those wider questions. Similarly, around communication, what are the things that are really important for you to be able to communicate about, or who it's really important to communicate with, what are the norms within that particular family or community around who talks to whom about what are things that are okay to talk about, not okay to talk about, might be really useful. But obviously that's all really difficult because we know that we can't just kind of lump people together and say, well, you come from a particular social or ethnic or linguistic group. So that work with the individual and their family really is really, really important. So that opportunity to really get to know that person, see how they see the world is, I think, is absolutely vital.
Thank you, Julie. We've got another question, and you did touch on this, Julie, but I'll ask you to respond to this. So somebody's asked, how would you recommend supporting families who have a child with a learning disability and or autism who come from a culture which views these conditions as a form of punishment from God?
Thanks, Mark. So that's a really challenging question, really, isn't it? And Mark and I were talking a little bit about it in preparation for today. So I think firstly, that understanding that somebody may well understand that there's a medical cause for their particular condition they have, but there might also be a spiritual one as well. So you might say, okay, I understand that somebody has a particular condition, but the more spiritual understanding of that might be a why me, why now, or why my family, why now, sort of answer. So you can have both of those understandings together. I think the question really is perhaps more around supporting people is really around saying to people, what do they want? What are their aspirations? What are their expectations? We talked a little bit about what we might do in a situation where we were concerned in an extreme situation where somebody wanted to take what they considered was an appropriate spiritual religious response, and this is fairly unusual, I have to say. I'm not saying that a religious response is always this, but if if you've got a religious belief that said that you needed to do something to a person because you were worried that they were that this was caused by some kind of bad spirit, you wanted some kind of exorcism or spiritual activity that might be harmful for a child, I think this is the point where you've got to talk much more widely than with the family. Talk with your managers. Don't expect that you've necessarily got to come up with the answer immediately about what to do. Thankfully, those sorts of situations are really rare, but I think the real starting point with most families, as we all know, is working with the families. How do they make sense of something, and what does it mean they might want to do about it? And trying to ensure that you're respecting and listening to families' views, taking them on board unless you really think that somebody's doing something that's really unhelpful. And often students ask me about, what do you do if a family asks you about what you think, what your religious or spiritual views are? And I think finding ways to say, it's nice that you're interested, but actually it's not appropriate for me to talk about what I believe. This is about you and your family. But having those kind of answers prepared, because it's really hard if somebody suddenly throws it at you. But definitely, Mark and I were talking about how you don't have to have all the answers immediately. And particularly if you are worried, if it on that rare occasion that it became a safeguarding issue, for goodness sake, take advice from other people about appropriate ways to work. But I hope that is absolutely not the main issue you'd be coming across.
Thank you, Julie. And it just occurred to me when you were talking that everything you said would apply to whatever kind of client group you were working with, adults or children. Those are universal messages, really, aren't they? So thank you. We're having a few comments on the webinar, and thank you for your compliments. People are really interested in the cultural and spiritual factors that Julie's been talking about. We've got time for maybe one more question. So we did have a question about translating materials for people who don't speak English or speak very little English. So somebody says, in towns and cities where many different languages are spoken, what's the most financially feasible but also equitable way of adapting communication, e.g. appointment letters and advice sheets? They've said for parents who speak little or no English, but again, this could apply to adults that we're seeing as clients and their family members. And we talked about this as well, didn't we, Julie? And I don't think we as individuals can answer this question ourselves. There might be people listening who have answers to this. But what we thought was that, it would be probably really useful to talk to people who belong to the bilingualism Clinical Excellence Network, the Royal College Network, and who probably have experience of doing this kind of work. But also, whichever organisation you work in, there should be a patient information manager or somebody who's responsible for dealing with issues around equality and diversity. Within health and social care settings, there should be somebody that's responsible for implementing the patient information, the accessible information standard, NHS England's accessible information standard. So those are the sorts of people that I would be going to speak to, because they will have experience of preparing these kinds of materials in different languages. But I suspect also talking to local community groups from different cultural groups, and they would have lots of information about that. Okay, so we're going to finish the question and answer session there. But what I wanted to say before we end is we'd be really grateful if you'd fill out the evaluation form that's going to pop up in a new window once the webinar window closes. And it will also be sent out in the post-webinar email. Remember that the webinar has been recorded and it will go online with the slides in about 2 weeks' time. And we just wanted to let you know about another webinar in our series. So there are many future webinars planned, but the next webinar, Giving Voice to Trans People, will be, as it says on the slide, on the 31st of March from 1 until 2. So we really hope you can join us for that event. And I'd just like again to thank you all for joining us. I hope it's been useful. Do stay in touch, get in touch with us. We had a question about whether non-RCSLT members can access the recording. I'm just asking, I think the answer to that, Ludovica, is yes, you can. We'll certainly let you know how you can do that. So thank you all once again for joining us. Happy European Day on Friday. I hope you celebrate. I hope you spread the word about our wonderful profession and the needs of the people that we work with. Thank you very much.